The whip hung on the overseer's porch at sunrise, charred black as midnight coal, each iron-tipped braid twisted into shapes that shouldn't exist in nature. Marcus Whitley stumbled backward when he saw it, his coffee cup shattering on the wooden planks. He'd locked every door and window the night before, checked them twice, but there it was. The same instrument he'd used to break men's spirits for 15 years returned to him in a way that made his blood run cold. The slaves whispered that Tobias Grant had come back, that he'd stood over Whitley in the darkness glowing like forge coals, and within 3 days the overseer would flee Limestone County claiming he'd never sleep again. But how did a man who'd escaped 6 months prior walk back onto the plantation, into a guarded house, and leave without a trace? Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The story begins not with that terrifying morning, but 18 months earlier, when Tobias Grant was still just another back bent over cotton rows on the Pemberton plantation in northern Alabama. The year was 1857. And the world seemed locked in patterns older than anyone's memory. Tobias was 28 years old, tall and broad-shouldered, with hands that could gentle a spooked horse or build a chair that would last 3 generations. His mother had died bringing him into the world, and his father, a man named Cyrus whom Tobias barely remembered, had been sold away when Tobias was only 4 years old. What remained were fragments, the smell of pine tar, the sound of humming, and a single carved wooden bird that Tobias kept hidden in a cloth beneath the floorboards of his cabin. Marcus Whitley had arrived at the Pemberton plantation in the spring of 1856, replacing an overseer who'd grown too old and too soft for Harrison Pemberton's liking. Whitley came from Mississippi, where he'd earned a reputation for breaking the most stubborn slaves and maximizing cotton yields through methods other overseers whispered about in disapproval, but couldn't argue with in terms of results. He was a man of medium height with pale eyes that seemed to look through people rather than at them, and he carried a whip unlike any other in the county. It was longer than standard, braided from bull hide treated with oils that kept it supple, and its 9 tails each ended in small iron beads that had been filed into irregular shapes. When Whitley swung that whip, it didn't just mark flesh, it tore it, leaving scars that twisted and puckered in ways that never quite healed properly. Tobias first felt the whip 3 weeks after Whitley's arrival. The offense was minor, pausing too long at the water barrel during the hottest part of the afternoon. But Whitley believed in establishing dominance early. He ordered Tobias to remove his shirt in front of the other field workers, and when Tobias complied without protest, Whitley seemed almost disappointed. The first strike came across Tobias's shoulders, and the pain was unlike anything he'd experienced before. It wasn't just the initial impact, but the way those iron beads dragged across his skin, pulling and tearing. Whitley delivered 3 more strikes, each one methodical and precise, never hitting the same spot twice, but creating a pattern across Tobias's back that would ache for weeks. What bothered Tobias most wasn't the pain itself, but the principle behind it. He'd broken no real rule, done nothing that warranted such punishment. Yet, Whitley had chosen him deliberately. Over the following months, Tobias came to understand that he'd been selected for something worse than random cruelty. Whitley had identified him as what the overseer called a keystone, someone whose will, if broken, would demoralize the others. Tobias was respected among the slaves, known for his quiet competence and the way he could mediate disputes without raising his voice. Whitley seemed determined to either shatter that respect or eliminate Tobias entirely. The plantation itself was a world contained within borders that most of its inhabitants would never cross. 1,500 acres of land stretched along the Tennessee River, with cotton fields consuming most of the cleared space. The big house sat on a hill overlooking everything, a white-columned structure that Harrison Pemberton had built to impress visitors from Montgomery and Mobile. Pemberton himself was 43 years old, a second-generation plantation owner who'd inherited the land from his father and expanded it through a combination of aggressive purchasing and strategic marriage. He had a wife named Constance who spent most of her time in the big house embroidering or writing letters to relatives in Virginia, and 2 sons who were away at university in South Carolina learning law and literature. The slave quarters consisted of 23 small cabins arranged in 2 rows behind the cotton barn. Each cabin housed between 4 and 8 people, depending on family size, and the spaces were cramped but kept reasonably dry, thanks to repairs that Tobias and a carpenter named Benjamin had made the previous winter. There was a small church building that doubled as a schoolhouse, though teaching slaves to read was illegal, and Pemberton strictly forbade it. Still, some knowledge passed through anyway, whispered lessons given by an old woman named Patience, who'd learned her letters from a sympathetic mistress decades earlier, and who taught selected children in the darkest hours of night. Tobias lived in a cabin with 3 others, all men who worked the fields. There was Isaac, who was 51 years old and missing 2 fingers from his left hand after a cotton gin accident years before Whitley's time. There was Joseph, 22 years old and prone to angry outbursts that got him in trouble at least once a month. And there was young Daniel, just 16, who'd been sold to Pemberton 6 months ago after his previous master died, and whose family he'd never see again. The 4 men had formed an uneasy family of sorts, sharing meals and watching out for one another when Whitley's attention turned their way. The rhythm of plantation life followed patterns dictated by season and crop. Cotton planting began in April, when the soil warmed enough to receive seeds. The work was back-breaking but communal, and there was almost a music to it, the sound of hoes breaking earth in unison, the call and response of work songs that kept time and maintained spirits. By June, the cotton plants stood waist-high, and the real labor began, chopping weeds between rows under a sun that turned the sky white with heat. August brought picking time, when every hand on the plantation, including children as young as 7 or 8, moved through the fields with sacks dragging behind them, filling baskets that were weighed and tallied and then emptied into wagons bound for the cotton gin. Whitley prowled these fields on a gray horse he'd named Judgment, a tall gelding with mean eyes that matched its rider's disposition. The overseer had a system. He'd ride the rows watching for any sign of slacking, and when he spotted someone whose basket wasn't filling fast enough or whose hands moved too slowly, he'd dismount and approach with that whip coiled at his side like a sleeping snake. Sometimes he'd simply speak, his voice low and filled with promises of consequences. Other times he'd unfurl the whip and let it crack in the air, the sound sharp as rifle fire. And sometimes, when he felt the need to make an example, he'd use it. Tobias received the whip 7 more times over the course of that first summer under Whitley's authority. The reasons varied. A missed weed here, a basket that came up 2 pounds light there, but the pattern was clear. Whitley was testing him, pushing to find the breaking point. Other slaves suffered too. Joseph took 3 lashings in 1 week. After talking back, Isaac got struck across the legs when he couldn't keep the pace, Whitley demanded, and young Daniel was whipped so severely for accidentally dropping a basket full of picked cotton that he couldn't work for 4 days afterward. But it was Tobias whom Whitley returned to most often, as if the overseer sensed something in him that required special attention. After each punishment, Tobias would return to his cabin, and Isaac would help clean the wounds, while Joseph paced and muttered about revenge, and Daniel sat silent with eyes that had gone hollow. Tobias bore it all without complaint, but something was changing inside him, a coldness spreading from his center that had nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with calculation. There was a woman on the plantation named Rachel, 31 years old, who worked in the big house as a cook and had eyes that noticed everything even when she pretended not to see. She'd been born on the plantation, daughter of a woman who'd died in childbirth, and a father who'd been sold before she could form memories of him. Rachel had a daughter of her own, a bright-eyed girl named Clara who was 9 years old and who helped her mother in the kitchen, learning recipes and skills that might someday keep her out of the fields. Rachel and Tobias had known each other since childhood, and there'd been a time, years ago, when something tender had passed between them, but circumstances and fear had prevented it from growing into anything permanent. Rachel noticed the marks Whitley left on Tobias. She saw how the scars accumulated, how Tobias's face grew harder and more distant even as his hands remained gentle when he helped Daniel mend a broken chair, or when he showed Isaac an easier way to grip the hoe that wouldn't strain his damaged hand. One evening in late September, when Tobias came to the kitchen door to deliver firewood, Rachel pulled him aside and spoke words that would later echo in his mind during the darkest moments of what followed. "You planning something?" she said. Not quite a question, more an acknowledgement of what she'd observed. "I can see it in how you go still when Whitley rides past, like you're not even here anymore, like you're somewhere else working on some problem nobody else can see." Tobias had looked at her for a long moment, and in that look was everything he couldn't say out loud. Yes, he was planning something, not revenge in any simple sense, but escape, freedom, a refusal to break under Whitley's systematic cruelty. He'd been studying the plantation's rhythms, noting when guards changed positions at night, where the dogs were kenneled, which parts of the property line were watched, and which were not. He'd been talking quietly with other slaves, gathering information about the world beyond Limestone County, about routes north and safe houses, and the underground railroad that existed in whispers and faith rather than maps and certainty. "If you go," Rachel had said, her voice dropping to barely more than breath, "don't tell me when, don't tell me how. Just go, and don't look back. And don't let what happened here pull you into something that gets you killed." But Tobias had already understood that he couldn't simply leave. Or, rather, he could leave, but it wouldn't end the thing that needed ending. Whitley would still be there, still carrying that whip with its iron-tipped braids, still breaking people who deserved better than to be broken. And even if Tobias made it to freedom, even if he found his way to Ohio or Canada, or some place where he could live without chains visible or invisible, he'd carry the knowledge that he'd left others behind to suffer what he'd escaped. The incident that finally pushed Tobias toward action came in early November, when the cotton harvest was nearly complete and attention turned toward preparing fields for winter. Young Daniel had been working to repair a section of fence near the eastern property line when Whitley rode up and accused him of deliberately damaging the posts to create more work and avoid field duty. The accusation was absurd. Daniel was one of the most conscientious workers on the plantation, but Whitley wasn't interested in truth. He ordered Daniel tied to the fence he'd been repairing and delivered 15 lashes with that terrible whip, each strike carefully placed to maximize pain without causing injury that would prevent work. Tobias had been close enough to hear Daniel's screams, close enough to see how the young man crumpled when Whitley finally stopped and ordered him cut down. That night, Daniel lay in their cabin with his back, a raw mess of blood and torn flesh, and Isaac worked with cloths soaked in water and whatever herbs could be found, while Joseph punched the wall until his knuckles bled and cursed a world that allowed such things. Tobias sat beside Daniel through the darkness, watching the boy's face twist with pain even in unconsciousness. And something fundamental shifted in his thinking. He couldn't fix the world. He couldn't end slavery or bring justice to all the overseers and masters and systems that supported it. But he could do something about Marcus Whitley. He could ensure that this particular man, with his particular whip and his particular taste for calculated cruelty, faced consequences for what he'd done. The plan that formed in Tobias's mind over the following weeks was complex, requiring careful timing and absolute secrecy, but it centered on a simple truth he'd observed. Whitley was ultimately just a man, and men could be frightened. Tobias began by gathering information about Whitley's habits outside of his overseer duties. He learned that Whitley lived alone in a small house near the front gate of the plantation, a structure nicer than the slave quarters, but hardly grand. 2 rooms and a porch with a roof that leaked when it rained hard. Whitley kept to himself mostly, didn't drink with the other white men in town, didn't attend church or socialize beyond what his position required. He spent evenings alone, and people who passed by his house sometimes heard him talking to himself in the darkness. Full conversations with people who weren't there. There was a man named Abraham who worked as a blacksmith on the plantation, maintaining tools and shoeing horses, and doing the 100 small metal works that kept agricultural operations functioning. Abraham was 47 years old, powerfully built, despite a childhood injury that left him with a pronounced limp, and he possessed skills in metalwork that went beyond simple repairs. Tobias approached him carefully, testing the waters with indirect questions before finally asking if it would be possible to create something specific, a metal object that could withstand high heat and be worked into unusual shapes. Abraham studied Tobias with eyes that had seen too much to be easily surprised, and after a long silence he said, "You're thinking about doing something foolish." Maybe," Tobias had replied. "Or maybe I'm thinking about doing something necessary." "Those 2 things aren't always different," Abraham said. "You want to tell me what you need, or you want to keep dancing around it." So Tobias explained. Not everything, but enough that Abraham understood the direction, if not the destination. He needed metal worked in a particular way, bent and twisted with precision, able to hold shapes that weren't quite natural. He needed it done quietly, without drawing attention, and he needed it completed within a month. Abraham listened without interrupting, and when Tobias finished, the blacksmith sat silent for so long that Tobias thought he might refuse. Finally, Abraham spoke. "I'll do it, but not because I approve of whatever you're planning. I'll do it because Whitley gave my son 10 lashes last month for singing while he worked. said the noise disturbed his concentration. "My son is 12 years old, and those scars won't ever fully fade. So yes, I'll help you, but whatever comes after, that's on you, and you better be prepared to live with it." The metalwork took 3 weeks, stolen hours in the blacksmith shop when Abraham was supposed to be alone, but Tobias would slip in through a back door and watch as the older man heated and bent and shaped pieces of iron into configurations that served Tobias's purpose. They worked mostly in silence, communication happening through gestures and nods, and slowly the components took form, parts of a puzzle that would only make sense when assembled in a specific way at a specific time. December brought cold that was unusual for northern Alabama, temperatures dropping below freezing several nights in a row, and a dusting of snow that melted by noon, but left the ground hard and unforgiving. The cotton harvest was complete, and attention turned to maintenance work and preparation for the next planting season. Whitley seemed, if anything, more irritable in the cold, his temper shorter and his whip quicker to appear, as if the weather offended him personally and he needed to reassert control over something. Tobias made his move on a night in mid-December when the moon was barely a sliver and clouds covered even that faint light. He'd spent weeks studying patrol patterns and guard routines, and he'd identified a 2-hour window between midnight and 2 in the morning when the eastern property line was essentially unwatched. The plan was simple in concept, but terrifying in execution. He would slip off the plantation, circle around through the woods to the north, and approach Whitley's house from an angle that would put him beyond the expected lines of patrol. He told no one he was leaving, not even Isaac or Joseph or young Daniel, who'd recovered from his lashing, but whose eyes still carried the shadow of it. Tobias simply waited until the cabin was full of the sound of sleeping men, then rose and dressed in the darkest clothes he owned, a shirt and pants both black with age and wear. He carried with him a small sack containing the metal components Abraham had created, wrapped in cloth to prevent noise. He also carried a piece of flint and steel for fire-making, and a length of strong cord he'd salvaged from broken tack in the stable. Leaving the cabin was the first test. The door hinges creaked, no matter how carefully he moved, but the sound was small and quickly swallowed by wind moving through bare branches. Tobias stood outside for a full minute, listening to the night, identifying each sound and cataloging it as threat or neutral. Dogs in the distance, but far enough away they weren't reacting to him. Voices from the direction of the big house, guards talking in low tones, but stationary and focused on their own concerns. Nothing that suggested he'd been noticed. The walk to the eastern property line took 20 minutes, moving carefully through darkness thick enough that he sometimes had to feel his way forward with hands extended. He knew this land intimately, had worked every acre of it over the years, and that knowledge served him now as he navigated without light, avoiding ditches and roots and areas where the ground was soft and would hold footprints. The fence that marked the boundary was simple rail construction, easy enough to slip through, and then he was off the plantation for the first time in 15 years, standing in woods that were simultaneously foreign and familiar. Circling north required another 40 minutes, moving parallel to the property line but far enough into the trees that he wouldn't be spotted by any guard who happened to glance outward. The woods were thick with undergrowth, blackberry bushes and scrub that caught at his clothes and scratched his hands, but he pushed through with patience born of necessity. Several times he heard movement nearby, deer most likely, though once something larger crashed, through brush to his right, and his heart hammered until the sound faded, and he could convince himself it had been a startled animal rather than a searching dog. When he judged he'd gone far enough north, Tobias turned west and began the most dangerous part of his journey, moving back toward the plantation but targeting Whitley's house specifically. He had to cross open ground, a cleared area about 50 yards wide where any patrol would spot him instantly. But his timing was precise. He'd counted the guards' circuit, knew they passed this section every 30 minutes, and he'd positioned himself to move across during the gap between patrols. The dash across open ground felt eternal, every step an opportunity for disaster. But he made it to the cover of a tool shed without alarm being raised. From there it was another 100 feet to Whitley's house, moving in short bursts from shadow to shadow, freezing whenever he thought he heard something that didn't belong to wind or settling wood. The overseer's house sat dark and quiet, no light visible through the windows, and Tobias crouched beside the front porch, feeling his pulse hammer in his ears loud enough that he worried someone might actually hear it. This was the moment of greatest risk, not the escape or the return journey, but what he was about to do. If Whitley woke, if there was some alarm Tobias hadn't anticipated, if anything at all went wrong, he'd be caught in the act, and punishment would be immediate and terminal. Slaves who attacked overseers, even indirectly, were made examples of, hanged in view of the entire plantation as a reminder of what happened when the order of things was challenged. But Tobias didn't intend to attack Whitley, not physically, not in any way that would leave marks or evidence of violence. What he planned was something else entirely, something that would reach into the overseer's mind and plant seeds of fear that would grow until they consumed him. Tobias retrieved the metal components from his sack and began assembling them in the darkness, fingers working by touch alone, connecting pieces that Abraham had engineered to fit together in a specific configuration. When complete, the assembly formed a crude brazier, a metal basket that could hold coals and sustain heat for extended periods. Tobias had carried fire with him in the form of a small clay pot packed with slow-burning punk wood, material that could hold an ember for hours. He'd started it before leaving his cabin, a tiny core of heat wrapped in insulation, and now he transferred coals from the pot to the brazier, blowing gently to encourage them to life. The glow was minimal, barely visible even in the darkness, but it was enough for his purpose. Next came Whitley's whip, which hung, as always, from a hook on the overseer's porch, coiled and waiting for morning. Tobias lifted it carefully, the leather familiar against his hands, each braid and iron bead a geography he'd felt across his back too many times. He should have felt hatred touching it, should have wanted nothing more than to destroy it completely. But what he felt instead was cold calculation, the understanding that this object was a tool, and like any tool it could be repurposed. He carried the whip to the brazier and began heating the iron beads on each braid's end, holding them over the coals until they glowed dull red. The metal didn't need to reach forge temperatures, just hot enough to alter its appearance and create the effect he wanted. As each bead heated, Tobias used a small pair of tongs Abraham had provided to bend and twist it, changing the shape from merely irregular to something that looked almost organic, as if the metal had grown rather than been formed. The work took over an hour, patient and precise, and twice Tobias had to freeze when he heard sounds from inside the house, footsteps or the creak of a bed or something that suggested Whitley might be waking. But each time the sounds faded back into silence, and Tobias continued his work, transforming the whip from an instrument of calculated cruelty into something else, something that would speak to fears Whitley didn't even know he carried. When all the iron beads had been reshaped and the leather itself had been charred in places from contact with the heat, Tobias had what he needed, a whip that looked as though it had been pulled from a fire yet remained structurally intact, each braid still strong but marked by changes that suggested forces beyond normal understanding. He let it cool completely, then hung it back on the hook, where Whitley would find it at sunrise, positioned exactly as it had been before, but transformed in ways the overseer couldn't ignore. The final element of Tobias's plan required him to enter Whitley's house, and this was the part that made his hands shake when he thought about it too clearly. He'd learned from Rachel that Whitley never locked his door, some arrogance or sense of invulnerability that made him believe no one would dare violate his space, and Tobias counted on that overconfidence now. The door opened silently, interior darkness complete, and Tobias stood just inside the threshold, listening to the sound of Whitley's breathing from the bedroom. Tobias had brought with him a small amount of a powder that Patience, the old woman who taught children letters in secret, had prepared from herbs and roots she'd gathered in the woods. It wasn't poison. Tobias had no interest in killing Whitley because death would be too simple an escape, but it was a substance that when burned would produce smoke that caused vivid dreams, sometimes nightmares, and temporary disorientation upon waking. Tobias scattered this powder in a metal dish he'd placed near the bedroom door, added a single coal from his brazier, and retreated quickly as the powder began to smolder and release its effects. He moved to stand at the foot of Whitley's bed, visible if the overseer were to wake, but counting on the smoke and darkness and the sheer impossibility of what was happening to prevent Whitley from believing his own eyes. Tobias had taken coals from the brazier and held them in a cloth treated with chemicals Abraham had mixed, substances that would make the coals seem to glow brighter than they should, casting a light that would make his skin appear luminous in the darkness. For 5 minutes Tobias stood there, holding the glowing coals at chest height, letting their light play across his features, and he watched as Whitley's breathing changed, becoming faster and more irregular, suggesting dreams that were turning darker. Twice the overseer's eyes opened briefly, focusing on nothing or perhaps on the figure standing over him, and Tobias saw the moment of recognition followed immediately by confusion, the mind unable to process what it was seeing and deciding it must be dreaming. Tobias didn't speak, didn't move beyond the slight sway that came from maintaining position over extended time, but he let his presence register in whatever corners of Whitley's consciousness were accessible through sleep and smoke-induced visions. He wanted to plant an image that would linger, that would surface in the overseer's mind at unexpected moments and fill him with doubt about what was real and what was dream. Finally, when he judged he'd been there long enough and risked staying no longer, Tobias retreated from the house as silently as he'd entered, taking the brazier and his tools with him, but leaving behind the powder still smoldering and releasing its effects. Outside, he hung the transformed whip on its hook one final time, stepped back to assess how it would appear in morning light, and satisfied that it would achieve the effect he intended, he began his journey back to the slave quarters. The return trip was in some ways more dangerous than the approach, because now he was moving toward dawn, toward a time when people would be rising and beginning their routines. But Tobias's timing held. He recrossed the eastern property line 20 minutes before the first patrol of morning would pass through, and he made it back to his cabin, with enough darkness remaining to slip inside without being observed. Isaac was awake when Tobias entered, sitting on his cot with eyes that knew something had happened, even if he didn't know what. He looked at Tobias for a long moment, taking in the scratches on his hands from moving through brush, the smell of smoke that clung to his clothes, the expression on his face that was some mixture of satisfaction and exhaustion. "You did something," Isaac said quietly, not quite an accusation, more an observation of fact. "I went for a walk," Tobias replied, stripping off the black shirt and replacing it with his regular work clothes. "Long walk," Isaac observed. "Hope it was worth whatever you risked." Tobias didn't answer that, simply lay down on his cot and closed his eyes, knowing he had perhaps an hour before rising bell would sound and the day would begin. He felt no regret for what he'd done, no second thoughts about the risk or the potential consequences if discovered, but he felt something else, a kind of completion, as if a chapter had closed, and whatever came next would be fundamentally different from what had come before. Dawn arrived cold and gray, the sky heavy with clouds that promised rain before noon. The plantation came to life with its usual rhythms, people emerging from cabins and stretching stiff muscles and moving toward the work that would consume the next 12 or 14 hours. Tobias rose with the others, ate a breakfast of cornmeal mush and weak coffee, and prepared to begin his day expecting it would be like any other. The scream that shattered morning stillness came from the direction of Whitley's house, a sound of pure terror that made everyone freeze and turn toward its source. It was Whitley himself, his voice carrying across the cold air with a quality that made even those who hated him feel a momentary chill. People began moving toward the sound, curiosity and concern mixing with the knowledge that whatever had happened was significant enough to break normal patterns. Tobias moved with the crowd, careful to show the same interest and confusion as everyone else, and when they reached Whitley's porch they found the overseer standing in his nightclothes, staring at the whip that hung from its usual hook, his face drained of color and his hands shaking. "It was in the house," Whitley was saying to no one in particular, his voice thin and stretched. "He was in the house, standing over me, glowing like coals pulled from Satan's own forge." Harrison Pemberton arrived minutes later, alerted by the commotion, and he took in the scene with the practical assessment of a man who'd learned to manage crises through years of plantation ownership. He saw the whip, saw how the iron beads had been twisted into shapes that looked almost alive in morning light, saw how the leather itself bore char marks that suggested intense heat, yet remained structurally sound. "Marcus," Pemberton said carefully, "tell me what happened." Whitley's explanation came in fragments, disconnected pieces that he struggled to assemble into coherent narrative. He'd woken to a smell of smoke and the sense that someone was in the house. He'd seen a figure standing at the foot of his bed, a man glowing with internal light that cast shadows in impossible directions. The figure had been Tobias Grant. Whitley was certain of it, the slave he'd whipped more than anyone else. But when Whitley had tried to move, tried to call out, his body wouldn't respond and his voice wouldn't work. "It was a dream," Pemberton said, his tone suggesting he was trying to convince himself as much as Whitley. "You had a nightmare brought on by something you ate, or, I don't know, stress from the season. Then explain the whip," Whitley demanded, pointing at the thing hanging on the porch. "Explain how it got like that, how those iron pieces got twisted and the leather got burned. That's not a dream, Harrison. That's real, as you and me standing here. Pemberton examined the whip, and Tobias watched from the crowd as the plantation owner's expression shifted from dismissive to concerned. The transformation of the whip was indeed real, undeniable, and there was no simple explanation for how it had happened. Someone would have needed access to significant heat, metalworking tools, and the ability to enter Whitley's property without being detected, all of which seemed impossible given the plantation's security and the constant oversight of slave movements. "We'll investigate," Pemberton said finally. "We'll account for everyone's whereabouts last night, and we'll determine what happened here. But Marcus, I need you to pull yourself together. The slaves are watching, and they cannot see you like this, frightened and disoriented. You understand what I'm saying?" Whitley nodded, but his eyes kept returning to the whip, and Tobias could see the overseer's mind working through possibilities, trying to reconcile what he'd experienced with any rational explanation. The crowd was ordered to disperse, return to cabins and prepare for the day's work. But the whispers had already started, speculation spreading through the slave quarters like fire through dry grass. Over the following days, the investigation Pemberton promised never materialized into anything substantial. Guards were questioned about what they'd seen or heard, but patrols had been routine, and no one reported anything unusual. The slaves were questioned, but everyone had alibis of sorts. Entire cabins full of people who could account for one another's presence through the night, and Tobias's cabin mates confirmed he'd been asleep in his cot when they'd last checked before succumbing to their own rest. Abraham the blacksmith was questioned specifically about the metalwork evident in the whip's transformation, but he claimed ignorance, said he couldn't imagine how someone could have done such precise heating and shaping outside of a proper forge, certainly not in the darkness and secrecy required to avoid detection. The investigation stalled and eventually ceased, leaving the incident unsolved but thoroughly discussed, a mystery that would be debated in the slave quarters and the big house alike. Whitley himself changed after that night. He still carried out his duties as overseer, still rode through the fields on judgment and observed the work, but the whip stayed on his porch, untouched. He acquired a new one, shorter and simpler, but he used it rarely and without the enthusiasm he'd shown before. People noticed how his eyes would track Tobias when the slave was working, following him with an expression that mixed resentment with something that looked very much like fear. The overseer began spending more time alone, and those who passed his house in the evening reported hearing him talking to himself again. Full conversations that grew increasingly agitated as weeks passed. He started sleeping with lamps burning in every room, claiming he needed light to work on plantation records late into the night. But everyone knew it was because he couldn't bear darkness anymore, couldn't face the possibility that something might be standing over him unseen. Rachel noticed the changes and commented on them one evening when Tobias came to deliver firewood to the kitchen. "Whatever you did," she said quietly, making sure they were alone, "it's eating him from the inside. You see how he looks now, like he's aged 10 years in 3 weeks." "I haven't done anything," Tobias replied, the necessary lie spoken without conviction. "Sure," Rachel said with a small smile, "and that whip transformed itself through force of will." "Tobias, I don't know the details, and I don't want to, but I hope you understand that this won't end the way you think it will. frightening a man like Whitley. That's not freedom. That's just a different kind of chain. Her words stayed with Tobias over the following weeks, and he wrestled with them during the long hours of field work. She was right in a sense. What he'd done hadn't freed anyone, hadn't changed the fundamental conditions of their lives, but it had achieved something. Whitley's reign of casual cruelty had been checked, his use of that terrible whip eliminated, and the atmosphere on the plantation had shifted in subtle but meaningful ways. Winter deepened into the coldest January anyone could remember, temperatures dropping low enough that water in barrels froze solid overnight, and work had to be delayed some mornings until the sun could warm the ground enough to make it manageable. Whitley grew increasingly erratic, his behavior marked by sudden outbursts, followed by periods of withdrawn silence. Pemberton noticed. Everyone noticed. But the plantation owner seemed unsure how to address the situation, reluctant to replace an overseer who still technically performed his duties, but clearly suffering from something that couldn't be seen or measured. The end came in early February, on a night when wind howled through bare trees and rattled shutters across the plantation. Tobias was awakened around midnight by sounds of commotion from the direction of Whitley's house, raised voices and running feet. He dressed and joined others who were emerging from cabins to investigate, and they found the overseer's house standing empty, door hanging open, lamps still burning, but the space abandoned. Whitley had fled, apparently in the middle of the night, taking nothing with him except the clothes he wore and a horse from the stable. A guard reported seeing him ride past at full gallop, heading north toward the county line, and when asked if he should have stopped him, the guard said Whitley had looked at him with eyes so wild that attempting to intervene seemed more dangerous than letting him pass. A search party was organized at dawn, not so much to bring Whitley back as to understand what had happened and recover the stolen horse. They found the animal 3 miles from the plantation, still saddled but without rider, and it took another day before word came from the next county that a man matching Whitley's description had been seen boarding a coach headed toward Tennessee, babbling about ghosts and demons and refusing to speak coherently. Pemberton hired a new overseer within a week, a man named Crawford, who came from Georgia with references that praised his firm but fair management style. Crawford arrived, surveyed the plantation, and implemented changes that relaxed some of the harsher policies Whitley had enforced. The transformed whip still hung on the porch of the overseer's house, and Crawford asked about it his first day, received various versions of the story, and eventually removed it, saying he preferred not to start his tenure with reminders of his predecessor's troubles. Tobias watched all of this with satisfaction that was tempered by the knowledge that fundamentally nothing had changed. Whitley was gone. Yes, but slavery remained. The plantation continued operating, as it always had, and the freedom he'd given himself and others was measured in smaller increments of suffering rather than actual liberation. Still, young Daniel's back had healed with scars that were testimony to Whitley's cruelty, and at least no new scars would be added by that particular hand. The story of Tobias and the whip spread beyond the Pemberton plantation, carried by slaves who traveled between properties, and by whites who found the tale too strange and compelling not to repeat. The details shifted with each retelling, growing more elaborate and supernatural, but the core remained consistent. A slave named Tobias Grant had somehow returned his overseer's whip in a way that broke the man's mind and drove him from the county. Some versions claimed Tobias had made a deal with dark forces trading his soul for the power to exact revenge. Other versions insisted he'd learned voodoo from an old woman who remembered the old ways from Africa. Still others suggested he'd never actually done anything at all, that Whitley had simply gone mad from guilt, and the whip's transformation was nothing more than coincidence or perhaps divine judgment for the overseer's sins. Tobias never confirmed or denied any version of the story, and the few people who suspected the truth, Isaac and Rachel and Abraham, kept their suspicions private, understanding that some mysteries were better left unsolved. What mattered wasn't the precise mechanism of what had happened, but the effect it created, a reminder that even in a system designed to crush resistance, individuals could find ways to push back, to assert their humanity, and to create change even if that change was limited and temporary. The years that followed saw Tobias continue working on the Pemberton plantation under Crawford's oversight. Conditions that were marginally better than before, but still defined by the fundamental injustice of one human owning another. He thought often about escaping, about making a run for true freedom rather than settling for these small victories. But circumstances and responsibilities kept him in place. He'd formed bonds, taken on informal roles of leadership and mediation, become someone others depended on, and walking away felt like abandoning people who needed what stability his presence provided. The months following Whitley's departure brought changes that rippled through the plantation in ways both subtle and profound. Crawford, the new overseer, proved to be a man of his word, implementing policies that reduced the casual brutality that had characterized daily life under his predecessor. He still carried a whip. It was expected of an overseer in Alabama in 1858, but he used it sparingly, and never with the calculated cruelty that Whitley had displayed. The difference was noticeable enough that people began to relax in ways they hadn't been able to before. Conversations grew louder during evening hours. Laughter returned to the quarters, and the constant tension that had hung over everything under Whitley's watch began to dissipate. But Tobias found himself struggling with feelings he hadn't anticipated. He'd achieved what he'd set out to do, removed a source of torment and improved conditions for himself and others. Yet the victory felt incomplete in ways that troubled him during sleepless nights. The fundamental injustice remained unchanged. He was still property, still subject to being sold or punished or worked until his body gave out. And while Crawford might be more humane than Whitley, he was still an overseer, still an instrument of a system that treated people as commodities to be managed, rather than as human beings with inherent worth and rights. Rachel noticed his restlessness and commented on it one evening in early March when he came to the kitchen to deliver wood and found her alone, Clara having been sent to the big house with a message for Constance Pemberton. She looked at him with eyes that had known him long enough to read the signs others might miss, the way his shoulders carried tension even when he was supposedly at rest, how his gaze seemed to focus on distances beyond what was immediately visible. "You're thinking about leaving," she said. Not quite a question, but not quite a statement either. Something in between that invited response without demanding it. Tobias set down the armload of wood he'd been carrying and stood for a moment considering how to answer. "Sometimes," he admitted finally. "Not because things are worse. They're better in a lot of ways, but because being better isn't the same as being right. You understand what I mean?" Rachel nodded slowly. "I do, but understanding and approving are different things. You leave. You might make it north, might find freedom, or you might get caught and end up dead or sold so far south you'd never find your way back. Is that risk worth taking when things here have improved? That's what I keep asking myself, Tobias said, moving to lean against the wall near where she was working, close enough to talk quietly without being overheard if anyone approached. Part of me says be grateful for what you have, for the fact that you're not getting beaten regularly anymore, that people here look up to you and need you. But another part says that accepting an improvement in how you're enslaved is still accepting enslavement. And maybe that's a different kind of defeat than what Whitley tried to do. They talked for nearly an hour, voices low and careful, exploring the question from angles that had no easy answers. Rachel shared her own struggles with similar thoughts, how she sometimes imagined taking Clara and running, finding some place where her daughter could grow up free, but how the practical obstacles seemed insurmountable and the risks to Clara too great. They spoke of others who'd tried to escape over the years, some who'd succeeded and were rumored to have made it to Canada or Ohio, others who'd been caught and made examples of in ways that still haunted the memories of those who'd witnessed the punishments. Whatever you decide, Rachel said finally, make sure you're doing it for the right reasons. Don't run just because you're restless or because you feel guilty about settling for less than everything. Run if you truly believe freedom is worth dying for, because that's probably what it'll cost if you get caught. Her words stayed with Tobias through the spring and into summer as he continued working under Crawford's oversight, and he found himself paying closer attention to the world beyond the plantation's boundaries. He listened to conversations between white men when he was close enough to overhear, piecing together information about tensions between North and South, about debates over slavery's expansion into new territories, about growing movements of abolitionists who believed the entire system should be dismantled immediately. The country was moving toward some kind of reckoning. Even those who tried to ignore it could feel the pressure building, and Tobias began to sense that waiting might be the wisest course, that changes were coming that would be larger than any individual escape could achieve. In June of 1858, Harrison Pemberton purchased 3 new slaves from a trader passing through Limestone County, a family consisting of a man named Marcus, his wife Helen, and their 13-year-old son James. The coincidence of the man sharing a name with the departed overseer was noted and commented on. But this Marcus was nothing like Whitley. He was quiet and intensely focused on keeping his family together, and within weeks, the plantation community had absorbed them with the easy familiarity that came from shared circumstances. Tobias found himself drawn to James, seeing in the boy something of what Daniel had been when he'd first arrived, young, frightened, trying to understand the rules of a new place while processing the trauma of being separated from everything familiar. Tobias took time to show James how things worked on the Pemberton plantation, which white people to avoid beyond the necessary interactions, which slaves could be trusted with confidences, how to pace work to avoid exhaustion while still meeting expectations. The boy was bright and learned quickly, and a friendship developed that reminded Tobias he was capable of connection even as he wrestled with questions about his own future. Abraham the blacksmith suffered a stroke in August, a sudden event that left the right side of his body weakened and his speech slurred, and Tobias found himself spending hours at the older man's bedside, helping with tasks Abraham could no longer manage alone, and listening to stories about the blacksmith's life before the Pemberton plantation. Abraham had been born free in South Carolina, the son of a freed slave, and a white woman who defied her family to marry him, and he'd lived the first 17 years of his life experiencing a liberty he'd assumed was his by right. Then, his mother had died, and distant relatives had challenged his free status in court. Producing documents they claimed proved his father had never been properly manumitted, and Abraham had found himself enslaved despite having lived free for nearly 2 decades. "That's the thing nobody tells you about freedom," Abraham said one evening, as Tobias helped him sit up to eat soup that Helen had prepared and sent over. "It's not something you have or don't have. It's something you have to defend constantly. And if you're black in this country, there's always someone looking for ways to take it from you. Even when you're free according to law, you're never really free, because the law can change, documents can be challenged, and people who see you as property will find ways to make that perception reality." The stroke had left Abraham philosophical in ways he hadn't been before, as if his brush with mortality had loosened whatever restraints had kept certain thoughts unspoken, and Tobias treasured these conversations even as they complicated his understanding of what escape might actually achieve. If freedom itself was so precarious, so subject to being revoked or challenged, then what exactly was he running toward? The question haunted him during the harvest season, when work intensified and thoughts had to be pushed aside in favor of the immediate demands of getting cotton picked and processed before weather turned. Crawford proved his competence that fall, managing the harvest with an efficiency that impressed even Pemberton, and there was talk that yields would be higher than they'd been in 5 years. The slaves benefited indirectly from this success through slightly better rations and a relaxation of evening restrictions, small concessions that Crawford argued would maintain morale and productivity into the following year. It was manipulation, certainly, keeping people compliant through carefully calibrated gestures rather than through terror, but it was manipulation that made daily life measurably better, and Tobias found himself conflicted about how to feel about that. Young Daniel, now 18 years old and grown into a man physically even if the law still classified him as property, approached Tobias one October evening with a proposal that caught him completely off guard. Daniel had been courting a young woman named Sarah who worked on a neighboring plantation, and he wanted to ask Pemberton for permission to marry her, which would require negotiations between the 2 plantation owners and agreements about where the couple would live and who would own any children they might have. "I know it's not real marriage," Daniel said, anticipating Tobias's objections. "I know Pemberton can split us up any time he wants, can sell me or her or both of us tomorrow, if the mood takes him. But I love her, Tobias, and she loves me, and even if we only get a few years together, isn't that worth something? Isn't choosing to build something beautiful even in the middle of all this ugliness a kind of resistance?" Tobias didn't have a good answer to that, and he realized his own thinking had become rigid in ways that perhaps weren't helpful. He'd been so focused on the injustice of the system, on the ways it dehumanized and destroyed, that he'd lost sight of how people found meaning and connection despite those conditions. Daniel's question reminded him that resistance took many forms, that sometimes the most radical act was simply insisting on your humanity, on your right to love and hope and build relationships, even when the world said you were property without such rights. He helped Daniel prepare his request to Pemberton, coaching him on how to frame it in ways the plantation owner might respond to favorably, and when permission was granted and negotiations with Sarah's owner were completed successfully, Tobias stood witness at the ceremony that joined them together. It was a modest affair, conducted by patients who'd assumed the role of spiritual leader for the slave community. But it was genuine and filled with joy that felt like defiance against everything that sought to crush it. The winter of 1858 into 59 was mild, and work continued through months that normally would have allowed for some rest. Pemberton decided to clear additional acreage for cotton expansion, and teams of men spent weeks felling trees and pulling stumps, work that was grueling even in cool weather. Tobias worked alongside Isaac, whose age was catching up with him in ways that made the heavy labor increasingly difficult, and he found himself covering for the older man when Crawford's attention was elsewhere, taking on extra loads to compensate for what Isaac could no longer manage. Isaac noticed and was grateful, though he expressed it through gestures rather than words. A hand on Tobias's shoulder at the end of a long day. An extra portion of food slipped onto Tobias's plate when no one was looking. They'd lived together for years now, had weathered Whitley's reign and witnessed his departure, had shared the small victories and large sorrows that defined life in the quarters, and something like genuine family had formed between them, despite the absence of blood relation. In February, word reached the plantation that Marcus Whitley had been found dead in a boarding house in Memphis, Tennessee. The details were sparse, but apparently he'd been living alone, doing occasional work as a guard at a warehouse, and his landlady had discovered his body when she'd gone to collect overdue rent. There was speculation about the cause. Some said his heart had simply given out. Others whispered about drink or laudanum, but no one knew for certain. The news rippled through the slave quarters with reactions that ranged from satisfaction to unease, and Tobias felt nothing beyond a distant curiosity about how the story had ended. He thought about the night he'd stood over Whitley holding those glowing coals, about the fear he'd seen in the overseer's eyes when they'd opened briefly and registered his presence before sleep claimed him again. Had that night planted something in Whitley that had grown and consumed him? Had the fear Tobias had deliberately cultivated metastasized into something that eventually destroyed the overseer from within? Or had Whitley simply been a man predisposed to cruelty, who'd finally faced consequences for his actions and found himself unable to live with the weight of what he'd done? The questions were ultimately unanswerable, and Tobias decided that perhaps they didn't need answers. What mattered was that Whitley was gone, that his particular brand of cruelty had been stopped, and that in some small way, Tobias had contributed to that outcome. It wasn't freedom, and it wasn't justice in any complete sense, but it was something, and in a world that offered so few opportunities for meaningful action, something was better than nothing. Spring of 1859 brought changes that would prove more significant than anyone realized at the time. Abraham died in his sleep one April night, peacefully according to those who found him the next morning, and his passing was mourned by the entire plantation community. Tobias helped build the coffin, using skills Abraham had taught him years before, and he carved into the wood a small bird similar to the one his own father had made, a gesture of respect and continuity that felt appropriate even if no one else would understand its full significance. At the funeral, Tobias found himself thinking about legacies, about what people left behind when they died, and how influence continued even after physical presence ended. Abraham had taught him metalworking skills that had made possible the transformation of Whitley's whip, had passed on knowledge that would stay with Tobias for the rest of his life, and in that transmission something had survived that would outlast individual mortality. It was a kind of immortality available even to those whom the law considered property. The ability to shape future events through knowledge and skills shared across generations. The summer brought news from beyond Alabama that captured everyone's attention, even as daily work continued without interruption. There was violence in Kansas, battles between pro-slavery and anti-slavery forces, fighting for control of the territory's future, and the conflict was spreading in ways that suggested the tensions Abraham had spoken about were reaching a breaking point. White men talked about it in worried tones, slaves discussed it in whispers, and everyone sensed that the country was approaching something that would require choosing sides in ways that had previously been avoided. Crawford seemed increasingly preoccupied as the year progressed, and people who paid attention noticed he spent more time in conversation with Pemberton, their discussions lasting late into evenings and marked by an intensity that suggested serious concerns. Tobias learned from Rachel, who overheard fragments of these conversations while serving in the big house, that Pemberton was worried about maintaining his wealth if slavery were actually abolished, that he was looking into alternatives like paid labor or different crops that might be less dependent on the current system. "He knows something's coming," Rachel said one evening as they sat on the kitchen porch, watching fireflies blink in the darkness. "Maybe not tomorrow or next year, but soon, and he's trying to prepare for it. That's more than most owners are doing. Most of them are just pretending everything will continue as it always has." Tobias felt a flicker of hope at this information, but it was tempered by realism born of experience. Even if slavery ended, what would replace it? Would former slaves suddenly be treated as equals, given land and resources and education to build new lives? Or would freedom be a hollow gift, legal but not practical, leaving people without support systems in a society that had always seen them as inferior? The war came eventually, the great national reckoning that tore the country apart and redefined what it meant to be American, what it meant to be free, what obligations the nation owed to people it had considered property for generations. Tobias was 34 years old when Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter, and the plantation descended into chaos as the conflict consumed resources and attention. As white men left to fight, and slave populations began to realize that the old order was collapsing around them, liberation came officially in 1863 with the Emancipation Proclamation, though in practice it took another 2 years for Union forces to occupy northern Alabama and enforce the new reality. Tobias remembered the day soldiers arrived at the plantation, how Pemberton had gathered everyone and announced they were free to go, how some people had wept and others had simply stood stunned, unable to process that the thing they'd dreamed of for lifetimes had actually arrived. Tobias stayed on the plantation for 6 months after liberation, working now for wages that were small but his own, helping to navigate the transition from slave labor to something that resembled employment, even if it carried echoes of the old arrangements. But eventually he felt the pull to move, to see what the world looked like beyond the boundaries he'd known. And he left one morning in the spring of 1866 with little more than what he could carry. He traveled north, working odd jobs and learning trades, finding that his skills in carpentry and metalwork were valuable in a country rebuilding itself. He settled eventually in Ohio, in a small town where he opened a workshop and built furniture that people praised for its quality and longevity. He married a woman named Grace who'd escaped slavery years before the war, and together they raised 3 children who grew up free in ways their parents had never experienced. Tobias never forgot the Pemberton plantation or the people he'd known there. He corresponded with Rachel, who'd also left and found work as a seamstress in Birmingham, and he learned through her letters about others. Isaac, who died peacefully in his sleep at the age of 63. Joseph, who'd moved west and been killed in some dispute over land. Young Daniel, who'd learned to read and become a teacher, helping other former slaves navigate literacy and citizenship. The story of the returned whip followed Tobias into his new life, though by then it had transformed so completely in the telling that he barely recognized it. People spoke of it as legend, as folklore, as one of those stories that might or might not be true, but that contained truths regardless of factual accuracy. Tobias listened to these versions and smiled, remembering the reality, the careful planning and execution, the fear and determination that had driven him to take such risks. He thought about Marcus Whitley sometimes, wondered what had become of the overseer who'd fled into the night and never returned. He heard rumors over the years that Whitley had ended up in an asylum in Tennessee, that he'd died young from some wasting disease, that he'd moved to Texas and lived out his days in solitude. But Tobias never sought confirmation. What mattered wasn't Whitley's fate, but what Tobias had proven to himself and others, that resistance was possible, that the powerful could be challenged, that even in the darkest circumstances humanity could assert itself in ways that mattered. In his workshop in Ohio, Tobias built a clock that kept nearly perfect time, its gears and mechanisms crafted with the precision he'd learned from Abraham so many years before. He placed it on a shelf where he could see it while he worked, and sometimes, when he heard it chiming the hours, he'd think about timing and planning, about how small actions executed with patience could create effects far beyond their immediate scope. Grace asked him once about Alabama, about what his life had been like before freedom, and Tobias had told her some of it, the parts that didn't hurt too much to remember. He told her about Isaac and Rachel and young Daniel, about the rhythms of plantation life, and the ways people found joy and connection, even in suffering. He told her about Abraham and his metalworking skills, about patience who'd taught children to read in secret, about the small resistances that had accumulated into something larger. He did not tell her about the whip, about the night he'd slipped back onto the plantation and stood over a sleeping overseer holding coals that made his skin glow like he was lit from within. Some stories were his alone, private accounts that he'd carry to the grave, and the whip was one of them. Let others speculate and embellish. Let the legend grow until it bore little resemblance to fact. That was fine, because the legend served a purpose that bare facts could not, reminding people that they had more power than they realized, that systems of oppression were maintained by fear, and that fear could be turned against those who wielded it. Tobias lived to be 71 years old, dying peacefully in his sleep with Grace beside him, and his children grown and successful in their own right. At his funeral, they spoke of him as a good man, a skilled craftsman, a loving husband and father, and those things were all true. But they also spoke of stories they'd heard, legends from before the war, about a slave named Tobias who'd done something that no one could quite explain, but everyone agreed had been remarkable. The whip itself, the physical object that had started everything, disappeared after Crawford removed it from the porch. Some said it had been burned, others that it had been kept as a curiosity by someone who collected strange artifacts, still others that it had simply been discarded as trash, metal and leather returning to earth. But occasionally, in the decades that followed, people would claim to have seen it, hanging in some dusty collection or museum. Iron beads, still twisted into shapes that suggested forces beyond normal understanding. Leather still bearing char marks from heat that shouldn't have been survivable. These sightings were never confirmed, always reported secondhand by people who'd heard from someone else who'd maybe seen something that might have been the whip, and Tobias's descendants would smile when they heard such stories, understanding that some objects, like some stories, took on lives of their own regardless of physical reality. What mattered wasn't whether the whip still existed somewhere, but what it represented. The moment when one man refused to be broken, when careful planning and courage had created an effect that rippled forward through time, inspiring others who heard the tale to believe they too might find ways to resist, to fight back, to assert their dignity in the face of systems designed to strip it away. And sometimes, on quiet evenings in that workshop in Ohio, Tobias would sit and listen to his clock marking time, and he'd remember standing in darkness holding coals and watching fear spread across a man's face, and he'd think that perhaps that moment had been worth all the risk, worth all the careful planning and danger, because it had proven something essential, that the powerful could be made to understand they were not invulnerable, that their victims were not helpless, and that sometimes the simple act of returning what had been used to hurt you, transformed and strange and undeniable, could speak louder than any violence or confrontation. The story of Tobias of Alabama, the slave who returned the overseer's whip before sunrise, lived on long after its participants had died, passed down through generations as both history and parable, both fact and legend. It reminded people that resistance took many forms, that courage could be expressed through careful planning as much as through direct confrontation, and that sometimes the most powerful response to cruelty was not to match it, but to transform it into something the cruel could not understand or control, leaving them to wrestle with fears they'd created in others, now turned inward upon themselves. And in the end, that was perhaps the truest thing about the story, the part that transcended the specific details of what Tobias had or hadn't done, that injustice creates its own vulnerabilities, that those who profit from suffering live with the knowledge that someday, somehow, that suffering might find ways to push back, and that the night is always darkest and longest for those who have the most to fear from what morning's light might reveal. Tobias Grant died in 1898, 42 years after the night he'd stood over Marcus Whitley, holding coals and watching a man confront the accumulated weight of his own cruelty. He was buried in a small cemetery in Ohio, his grave marked with a simple stone that gave his name and dates, and nothing more. But the stories continued, carried forward by people who understood that some truths needed the protection of legend to survive, that the precise details mattered less than the essential message, that the powerless were never quite as powerless as they appeared, that the powerful were never quite as secure as they imagined, and that sometimes the most effective rebellion was the one that planted seeds of doubt in the minds of oppressors, letting fear do what force of arms might never accomplish. The whip, charred and transformed, hanging on a porch at sunrise, remained the central image of the story, the thing people remembered when all other details had faded. It was impossible and real, supernatural and mechanical, a symbol of suffering returned, transfigured into something that demanded explanation but resisted simple interpretation. And perhaps that was exactly what made it powerful, the way it lived in the space between rational understanding and superstitious fear, challenging those who heard the story to decide for themselves what had happened, what was possible, and what responsibilities they had to resist injustice in whatever forms it took in their own lives. Tobias had given the world that image, that story, that moment when an overseer found his instrument of cruelty, returned to him transformed in ways he couldn't explain, and in doing so he'd created something that would outlast all the cotton harvests and land deeds and legal documents that had defined the world of 1857 Alabama. The story lived on, told and retold, embellished and simplified, but always carrying at its core the same truth, that one man had refused to be broken, had found a way to push back that hurt no one but changed everything, and had reminded all who heard the tale that resistance was always possible for those brave enough and clever enough to find the paths that led from suffering toward something better, something freer, something that honored the dignity every human being deserved, regardless of what laws or customs or economic systems claimed otherwise. And so the whip hangs still in memory, charred black as midnight coal, iron beads twisted into shapes that speak of forces beyond understanding, a testament to Tobias Grant of Alabama, who proved that sometimes the most profound victory isn't escape but return, not violence but transformation, not revenge but the simple act of making visible the fear that power always carries hidden beneath its surface, waiting for someone brave enough to bring it into the light where it can be seen and named and ultimately overcome.